Hey everybody, Christian here, and today I want to install and set up a Windows server in my Homelab. And yep, you got it right, I'm not talking about Linux today, we are really talking about Windows Server. Some people might be surprised that I want to use a Windows Server in my Homelab, but as an IT professional, the Windows Server is, in my opinion, a pretty important system to know, because a lot of companies use it as an Active Directory domain controller, which allows you to manage Windows clients in your network, centralize the users and groups, and distribute security policies. All these features are absolutely needed in any type of organizational infrastructure. And that is exactly what I'm looking at today. So I'm going to install a new Windows Server 2022 on my Proxmox hypervisor and configure it to create a new Active Directory in my Homelab for testing. I think this is a great project to learn something and play around a little with the Windows Server. This video is sponsored by Teleport, a free and open source access proxy that you can use to log into your IT infrastructure like Linux servers, Kubernetes clusters, databases, web applications, and also Windows servers by using the remote desktop. It's a very cool application that you can use in your Homelab completely for free because Teleport has a community edition. And if you want to use it in your company, just reach out to the Teleport team. I will put you a link in the description of this video. Okay, so before we start, just one thing to keep in mind. When you're planning to work with Windows servers, like most of Microsoft products, the Windows operating system isn't free. And the Windows server's licensing is a bit more complex than Windows for desktops. There are many different versions with different features and limitations, client user licenses, terminal server licenses, and all of that is out of the scope of this video. I'm also not going to recommend you a place where to buy these licenses or do any shady gray market sponsorships here on this channel. What I've done is, in my Homelab, I've downloaded the Windows Server 2022 evaluation license that's working for testing purposes for 180 days. And if you want to try out the Windows Server and build a lab environment with that, I guess that's quite a long time to test and try it out. If you seriously want to use the Windows Server because you're running a production network or in your company, just pay for a valid license. Okay, so I believe I've said everything that is important. Now let's get started and let's install the Windows Server. To download the latest version of the Windows Server, just go to the Microsoft Evaluation Center. So there you will find everything. And in here you can just download the official evaluation version of the Windows Server 2022. So that's the latest version when I'm recording this video. And here you can first get some more information about the product and how to get started with the new installation. You could also set it up as a virtual machine in Microsoft Hyper-V with a VHD file, or deploy a new instance in Microsoft Azure if you are in cloud deployments. But what we want to do is we just want to download the regular ISO image in the 64-bit version of the Windows Server 2022. And then I want to upload this ISO file on the Proxmox server so we can use it to install a new virtual machine. But before we can do that and install the Windows Server in Proxmox, we also need to do one more thing and download the virt.io drivers for KVM. So this is needed because the devices that Proxmox uses to virtualize the hard disks, the network interface, and so on, these require separate drivers, and they are usually not automatically included in the Windows operating systems. I guess this is also the case with Windows 10 and Windows 11. So you just need to download these drivers first and add them during the installation procedure of Windows. Otherwise the system doesn't detect the hard disks, the network cards, and so on. So you will find all the latest virt.io drivers on the official website of KVM. There you can just download them as an ISO and upload it to Proxmox server as well. Now that we have prepared everything, let's create a new virtual machine. I'm giving it a new VM ID and a name that represents my production Windows domain controller. Make it start up at booting. And I just selected the evaluation ISO image and set the guest operating system type to Windows 11 or 2022. So that is actually the same. In the next menu, we also need to select a few other things. So first is the TPM storage, which you might already know from Windows 11. And just like Windows 11, the Windows Server 2022 also requires the TPM in the version 2 on the system. And luckily, a virtual TPM is now supported in the latest version of Proxmox, so we can just select our local storage to be used as a virtual TPM, and that should be fine. In the next menu, I also want to adjust the disk settings and change the bus drive to VirtIO. So this should give us a better support and performance of the virtual hard drive. This, by the way, is exactly the step where it requires the VirtIO drivers to be installed. So what I've mentioned before. And the minimum disk size you should pick is at least 32 gigabytes. So that's mentioned in the official hardware requirements for the Windows Server, but I will raise it a bit. So just to have a little more space up front. Just like the disk requirements, it is important to give our virtual machine enough CPU cores. So I'm going to raise it to 4, and I also want to give it enough RAM. One thing to keep in mind here when you are planning to install the Windows Server with a desktop experience, so that's what I'm going to do, you need at least 2 gigabytes of memory for that. However, I can say it's not always fun to work with that value, so I have raised it to 8 gigabytes of memory in my case, which should be enough to have a smooth experience when you're administrating the server. Last but not least, I also changed the model of the network card to VirtIO, so same reason as for the hard drives. This requires the VirtIO drivers, and then just confirm it and save the virtual machine. So this is how you create a virtual machine. One more thing before we boot up the system and start the installation. We also need to add the VirtIO ISO that we just downloaded to this virtual machine by attaching it to a second virtual CD drive. So you can just use IDE here and select your VirtIO driver's ISO. And then everything should be fine. So we can now boot it up and press any key at the boot process. So that should start the installation of the Windows Server. When you're installing the Windows Server, you will soon see that this is very similar to installing a Windows desktop operating system. They use just the same graphics and menus, so you should already know how it works, hopefully. There are just a few things that are special. So for example, you can install the Windows Server in different versions, the standard data center version, and then you also need to decide if you want to install a full graphical user interface on that, or just skip it because you mainly want to manage it in PowerShell. So that's up to you how you prefer to install a Windows Server. As you can imagine, without a graphical user interface, the Windows Server requires much lesser resources. But I think the Windows desktop is pretty useful to administrate a Windows Server, as most things are very intuitive and straightforward here. That's always been the case for a Windows desktop and for the Windows Server as well. It's mostly administrated in graphical applications. Now we can proceed and install the operating system to the disk. Don't worry when you want to do that and it doesn't detect any hard drives yet. This is because I changed the disk driver in Proxmox to a VirtIO block instead of IDE or SATA. And we can now load additional drivers that Windows needs to detect this VirtIO disk, either from a USB stick or CD drive. And hence we have mounted the VirtIO ISO as a CD drive in this VM. We can just select this as a source. And it's important that you select the correct driver for your specific Windows Server version. So I'm going to change that and search the driver in the 2K22 directory. Select the driver that is visible here, and then it should detect our virtual hard disk. Select it and hit Next. This will now start the installation of the Windows Server operating system. Depending on how fast your hardware is, it should be more or less quick. If you're using an NVMe or SSD in Proxmox, that's where it really speeds up the whole process a lot. Once it has copied all the files, it restarts your virtual machine and you will see a Windows 10-like rotating circle that's indicating it's getting all the system files ready. And then you need to set the administrator's password first. So just pick a strong one here and then you should see the login screen of Windows. To log in, we need to pass through the Ctrl-Alt-Delete shortcut into the VM. In Proxmox, you can simply do that in the left menu and then just log in with your configured password. And that is a Windows Server desktop. Looks very familiar, right? It just looks like a Windows 10 desktop actually, because I guess it is the same desktop. But you will see the main difference here is that the Windows Server has the Server Manager. So that's a central management application you can use to configure and administrate all your Windows servers in your network. But we don't need it now, so let's just close it, because we need to do some post-installation steps, so they are very important for the Windows Server to run as a virtual machine in KVM. So first you should always install the complete VirtIO drivers, because we just did it for the hard disk during the installation procedure. Everything else, like the network card or some other component drivers, are still missing. Because the VirtIO ISO is still mounted, you can just open the virtual CD drive and execute the setup. So this should everything for you, like the balloon driver, that's very important for the dynamic memory management in Proxmox, or the network drivers, otherwise you don't get an internet connection, so make sure everything is selected here. and hit next. And then you will see it already detected our virtual network card during the installation. That's great. And every other driver was also installed. So let's just finish this setup. What you should always do is, when you install the new Windows Server after the installation of the drivers, is give this machine a static IP address, because when you install this as an Active Directory domain controller, what we do later, you also want to make sure that this is set before. So I'm giving this machine a static IP address from my local DMZ network. By the way, I just realized I did a minor mistake here with a subnet mask. It should be, in fact, 255.255.00, but all these settings are different for your network anyway, so just please enter whatever is needed in your network and set your gateway and DNS IP address according to your networking setup. And when you configured all of this correctly, you installed the drivers, you gave this a static IP and configured your gateway and DNS, the Windows Server should now be able to connect to the internet. What you can then do is do regular stuff like administrating, download the Windows Server updates and all of this stuff. I've just skipped it for this video because there's one more thing I want to show you, and this is a guest agent in Proxmox. So this is important for some guest functionalities like getting the correct MAC address and IP address or trigger system reboots properly. So you can see that the guest agent is currently not detected on the system because it's not installed. So let's go back to the virt.io disk, and in the guest agent folder, just run the 64-bit setup. After that, it should also show you the correct MAC and IP address of your Windows machine in the Proxmox web interface. So that tells us the agent is now correctly communicating with the KVM hypervisor. Okay, that was all pretty straightforward. I hope you are familiar with Proxmox and how to create virtual machines. There were just a few specifics that might be different for a Windows server than it is for a Windows client or maybe for a Linux machine, whatever. So I hope it made sense that we went through this whole process here. Now you can start using this Windows server for anything you want to use it for. And again, the main reason why I'm using this Windows server in my Homelab is the Active Directory, probably the most important feature in a Windows server. And this is also the reason why Microsoft has been so successful in the professional IT business over the last decades. But you might wonder, what is the Active Directory actually and how does it work? So you can see it as Microsoft's own implementation of a directory service. So that's something like a database which manages resources in a computer network. Things like computers, printers, users, file shares, groups, and many more. All these are things that we typically have in an organizational network. And the goal is to centralize the management of all these resources and provide a secure authentication and authorization for everything. All the resources in an Active Directory are maintained in a hierarchy structure, also called a domain. And inside a domain, we can create several organizational units. For example, if we have a department like accounting or sales or software development, we can assign the resources to these organizational units to keep visibility in our domain and manage permissions the users should have. Just a side note, which is not important for this video, but it's interesting to understand the Active Directory. In large organizations, you can also have something like a hierarchy structure of domains itself. So you can add child domains underneath, and above you can also connect multiple domains in a forest. For my Homelab, I'm not messing around with that. I'm only using a single domain that has its own name. And that's where I can add any Windows computers I want to manage, or I can create users, organizational units, define permissions or security policies, whatever I want to test here. So that's it about the organizational and the hierarchy structure of an Active Directory. The core of it is called a domain controller. So this is like the master of an Active Directory, and it authenticates all resources like users and computers, enforces policies, or also distributes software. For example, when you as a user, you log into a computer that's part of an Active Directory domain, the username and password first goes to the domain controller, which checks if it's correct and whether this user is active or if it's a normal user or a system administrator. You can imagine this is very important in company networks with thousands of Windows clients. Yeah, you don't want to go to every single computer, create a new user or reset a password here. In Active Directory, you can just do this on the domain controller, and then it becomes immediately active on every device in the domain. So that's really nice. When we are talking about a domain, you can probably imagine that DNS is very important for an Active Directory to function. This is the main protocol that maps resources to IP addresses. And there are also two more protocols involved. You might have already heard of LDAP before, or Kerberos, for example. So I'm not going over these specifics of these protocols here because that would go too far. But I'm saying this because if you're installing an Active Directory domain controller in your network, you will need to set up your DNS configuration right, because the computers you want to add to your domain, they need to find your Windows server that you're using as a domain controller. So it should either be the primary DNS of your entire network, or what you can also do is you can set up a DNS forwarding on your primary DNS server just for this specific zone that you want to use, and it's an Active Directory domain, and forward all requests for that zone to your domain controller. This is typically what you can set up on a firewall system or DNS servers. Don't worry, I will make a second video about this topic. There we will have a closer look at how I'm handling it in my Homelab and how to add computers and users to the Active Directory and how to work with policies. For this part here, I'm mainly just focusing on the Windows Server installation. And let's get a bit more practical now and install the Active Directory. To do that, we just need to install the correct server roles on our Windows Server, and then it can become an Active Directory domain controller. How that exactly works, I'm going to show you now. We will start with the installation of the Windows Server roles. Here we can use the Server Manager to do that. Alternatively, you can also do this in PowerShell, of course. But before, we need to do one more thing, which is extremely important, and that is give this Windows Server a name, because otherwise it will have a random name. And it's just like the IP address, a bit complicated to change it after the installation of the Active Directory. So let's give this server a name. Windows Domain Controller Production 1, for example. Don't select domain here at this point, just go with the workgroup. And then this server needs a quick reboot. Once this is completed, we are logged into the system again. In the Server Manager, click on the top menu, Add Roles and Features, and this will start an installation and configuration wizard. The Active Directory roles are in the role-based or feature-based installations, so here we just select our server and enable the following two roles: Active Directory Domain Services and the DNS Server role. So that is all we need for our domain controller. Of course, you can also enable any other roles or features you want at this step as well. But let's confirm this, and then the Windows Server will automatically install all the necessary roles and features. Once that is finished, our Windows Server is not a domain controller yet, because that was just the first part, the installation. To create a domain or join an existing one, we need to promote this server as a domain controller, and you will see a new alert mark in the Server Manager on the top menu. So just click on this flag and then promote this server to a domain controller. Now we have three different options. We can add this domain controller to an existing domain. So that's when you have multiple domain controllers and you want to replicate them for high availability and load balancing. We can also add a new domain to an existing forest. Remember, this is when you have large hierarchies and multiple domains in an organization. But we want the third option, add a new forest and create our root domain name. And then we need to create a new Active Directory domain and give this a name that you can resolve via DNS. And choosing the root domain name now might seem simple, but it's actually a pretty complex topic where I could make a separate video about. There are a couple of different opinions spread across the web about what is best practice here and what not. But when you're using this Active Directory for a local testing network, I think it's a good idea to just go with a non-public routable top-level domain, something like .home or .lan. And I will use the name AD for Active Directory .clcreative.home because I already have a DNS zone called clcreative.home, so I'm using this child zone only for my Active Directory root domain. Again, there are many different opinions on what is a good idea here and what not. In Homelabs it might not be so critical, but in case you want to use it in your company and you're not sure what to enter here, there are some great documentation on the official Microsoft homepage, and there are also some RFCs about best practices existing. I'll link you in the description what I found, and then you can look it up to be sure. Okay, so in the next window, you can customize a few other settings about the capabilities and functional level of this domain. This is mostly important when you're adding this server to an existing Active Directory domain, or if you have clients in your network that are pretty old. For example, if you have Windows XP or Windows 7 machines you want to join to this domain, this only works in older functional levels of the Active Directory because some features are not backwards compatible. But I hope you are all using Windows 10 or Windows 11, so the default level here is fine. You also need to set up a master password for the domain administrator account, so that's really important to remember. So you want to make sure that you're using a strong password that you store somewhere securely when nobody else has access. And in the next window, you might see a warning, depending on your root domain name and your DNS settings. In a local test environment, we can just ignore that and proceed. If you want to learn more about it, again, you will find great info about that in the documentation. You can also customize the net BIOS name, so it should be by default just the first part of your root domain, and I guess AD is fine for me. The other settings are also not so interesting for us, so we just skip them and go next. And then the wizard will do some prerequisites checks before it creates this Active Directory. Mostly, you will see only 2 warnings here. So the first is a security setting, which might be important to look at in production environments. So there are a few security settings you should disable, like legacy cryptography algorithms and so on. But again, it's not so critical in a test environment. And the second warning is, again, the DNS delegation warning we've seen in the window before. Because these are just warnings, we still can't proceed with the installation, so let's just do that. And this might now take a bit longer than the installation because there is a lot of stuff going on in the background here. If everything goes right, we should be prompted with a message that the Windows server needs a restart. Again. Yeah, Windows needs a lot of restarts during installation processes and loading screens. It is what it is. But once this is complete and we want to log in, you can see the login screen changed a bit after restart because we now have in front of our username our net BIOS name of the domain, the AD. So this indicates us we are now using our domain administrator account to log into this server, not our local user accounts anymore. So these are 2 different things in Windows. And here we need to enter the domain administrator password, and here we are again at the Windows desktop. So this server is now an Active Directory domain controller. As you can see, there have a few management applications been installed by Windows, such as the Active Directory Users and Computers tool. This is where you can create, edit, and delete users in your Active Directory. Here in the domain controllers, you can see the current server is present, or in the users, you can see the security groups in our domain administrator accounts. This is really nice, and I guess you might have a lot of questions now. What is this good for? How you can administrate it and how you can use it to manage Windows clients in your network? Well, that's part of the second video, because this one is already pretty long and I'd like to split a few topics about Windows servers in separate videos where it kind of makes sense. So in my next video about Active Directory, we will add a new Windows 11 PC to this domain. We will create a new user, create group policies. This is just the beginning of a whole new chapter. But I hope you still enjoyed it and could learn something, and yeah, I hope you are up for more stuff. Many thanks everybody for watching, and a special thanks goes out to my Patreon sponsors. You guys are just amazing, because this helps me a lot to create free tutorials for everyone. And as always, I will catch you in the next video. Take care everybody. Bye bye.